Good afternoon, and thank you so much for joining us for the NCORE webinar series. NCORE's webinars are the production of the Southwest Center for Human Relations Studies at the University of Oklahoma Norman campus. I'm Corey Davidson, the program assistant for NCORE, and I'm delighted to be your host today. Please use the chat to tell us where you are joining us from. This is the first webinar for the spring, and more webinars will be announced soon. Please visit our website for webinars on demand. Our presenter today is Sam Shelton. Sam Shelton is a queer and non-binary advocate, activist, and scholar. Their scholarship centers around critical disability studies and disability justice, intersectional social justice education, and anti-oppressive theorizations of violence and trauma. Their most recent scholarship can be found in DSQ, the International Journal on Responsibility, and the Canadian Journal of Disability Studies. You can learn more about Sam by emailing them at shelton@iastate.edu. And just a reminder that ASL and live captioning are available for this broadcast. Please post any questions in the Q&A box. Please welcome Sam Shelton.
Hello, everyone. Let me just get my screen shared here. Okay, hello. Thank you all for setting aside some time today to attend my presentation. I'm really glad that we can spend the next few hours being a virtual community with one another. And I look forward to any future collaborations that grow from this shared moment. Please feel free to connect with me in whatever ways you are able. My presentation is titled Queer Teaching for Racial Justice and Against White Supremacy. As an anti-racist queer educator, this topic is very dear to me and central in the work I do. So with that in mind, I want to recognize that my presentation is just a starting point. I welcome and encourage you to respond to my presentation and to improve it with your own experiences and insights. The best ideas are cultivated over time through ongoing collaboration with others. Before I get started with my presentation, I want to take a few moments to situate myself and where I am coming from, as well as some of the things you can expect during my presentation. The first part of this task is recognizing that I am a white settler occupying land taken from indigenous peoples. The land which I inhabit is physically situated in the ancestral homelands of the Bokotse or Iowa Nation. I pay respect to the Bokotse or Iowa peoples, past, present, and future, and their continuing presence in the homeland and throughout their historical diaspora. I make this acknowledgement with the critical understanding that it is a never enough, that violence and trauma against indigenous peoples is ongoing, and that I carry a responsibility to participate in and support movements against settler colonialism. Parts of my presentation today will be about that responsibility I embrace for my settler heritage and positionality. Next, I want to name my intention for this space to be one in which we honor people of all genders. Part of this task involves using the names and pronouns people claim for themselves. If you feel safe and comfortable doing so, I welcome you to follow the directions listed on this slide to add your pronouns to your Zoom display name. I also want to recognize that there are many reasons why people may feel uncomfortable or unsafe sharing your pronouns publicly in this space, and that's okay too. Just a few more quick things before we get started. I promise they won't take too long. Because much of the content in my presentation is based on histories of violence and ongoing realities of oppression, I encourage you to take whatever space you need for yourselves. You can feel free to mute me, move away from your computer for a while, engage in other tasks that help you to regulate and be present, such as knitting or drawing, or do anything else you need for yourself. Specifically, I will be talking about queer and transphobia, racialized violence, including sexual violence, and other related topics throughout my presentation. Next, I want to take a brief moment to discuss my positionality and some of the language I use. I am speaking from the position of a white settler queer educator. Much of the time, my audience is other educators in general, but sometimes I am specifically speaking to other white and/or settler educators. My intention in doing so is not to marginalize, but rather to recognize that white and/or settler educators, myself included, have a particular responsibility to teach against white supremacy because of how we are bound up in it. Additionally, you may notice throughout my presentation, I frequently separate Indigenous peoples from other peoples of color. I do this because in my research and experience, I have found that Indigenous folks are repeatedly erased from conversations about racial justice and white supremacy. So making sure that they are visible and that I am being accountable to them is a priority for me. Moreover, I think this recognition is especially important in light of the history of appropriation of Indigenous histories, cultures, and identities by queer and trans folks. With that said, now we can really get things started. I want to start with a quote from Marilyn Preston. Quote, "The work of queering pedagogy is messy and there is no map," end quote. I do not intend for my presentation to offer a map, but rather to serve as an invitation for you to enter the messiness of queer teaching. To that end, I have two brief stories to share that get at a central issue within queer studies and queer pedagogy. The first story takes place at the close of one spring term when I make a courageous, and I want you to hear ill-advised, decision to read the student evaluations from my latest Intro to Queer Studies course. I always carefully read through student evaluations because I am yet naive enough to want to be a good teacher and because I value my students' opinions. I read through these evaluations even though a lot of research seems to suggest that they are routinely biased against and ultimately detrimental to queer, trans, and disabled teachers like me, as well as to other people historically marginalized in the academy. This time, I discovered the typical mixture of assessments, ranging from thoughtful and engaged to "I missed the point of this class entirely," and "it's your fault I failed this class." One evaluation in particular stands out to me in its curious critique of my teaching. In the comment, one of my students proclaims that my queer studies course was so overly focused on race and white supremacy that it ceased to be queer studies. Now, I am well aware of the typical whitewashing of queerness and the racism present in many queer spaces, but this comment came as a surprise to me, since I had, throughout the 11-week term, emphasized the need to think with intersectionality, or with the understanding that all of our identities, social locations, and experiences are interwoven. Indeed, thinking about queer studies intersectionally means that we should always be centering analyses of white supremacy, as well as the numerous other systems and structures of power that collide with lived experiences of queerness. Around the same time, I was sitting in the shared graduate teaching assistant office for my program when someone knocked on the door. They introduced themselves as a representative from one of the cultural centers on campus and asked to put up a flyer for an upcoming event. We started talking for a while, and I told them that I teach some of the queer studies courses on campus, to which they responded by commenting on the well-documented whiteness of queer spaces. I wondered about their experience of queer studies. Would they have thought my class was too concerned with white supremacy or not enough so? Of course, this person's comments echoed many of the critiques people, especially queer and trans people of color, have expressed about the situation of queerness in academia and academic thought. In fact, their comment resonated with many of the conversations I strive to center in my teaching. Conversations, for instance, about how mainstream queer social movements have centered around the cultures and lived experiences of white queer communities, without naming how those communities are complicit in racial domination, settler colonialism, capitalism, ableism, and so on. Yet at the same time, I found myself wondering, can something truly be queer if it is not invested in intersectional social justice? In other words, in recognizing the frequent whiteness of queer spaces, including queer studies, was this visitor actually calling attention to the failure of these spaces to live up to the meanings and radical politics of queerness? In response to these stories, my presentation describes some ideas towards a practice of anti-racist queer teaching. Specifically, I maintain that queer teaching can neither be over-attentive to nor isolated from analyses of white supremacy or the other systems of power to which it is connected. To the contrary, queer teaching becomes more queer, more transgressive as it pursues racial justice, because doing so opens space for racial difference and for resistant expressions of gender and sexuality outside the narrow confines of heteronormative white supremacy. Racism is an inherently anti-queer thing. It depends upon queer and transphobia, as well as rigid ideas about which bodies should be sexual and with whom, in order to code people of color as abnormal, perverted, and dangerous. White supremacy normalizes and excuses white men's extensive sexual exploitation of Black, Brown, Asian, and Indigenous peoples, especially women, while simultaneously perpetuating a long history of abusing, incarcerating, and even murdering men of color for what are often consensual relationships with white women. The settler occupation of what is now known as the United States involved widespread suppression and violence against queer, trans, and two-spirit Indigenous peoples. My point in offering these examples is to evidence the fact that neglecting white supremacy and settler colonialism in discussions of queerness results in a partial picture, a kind of told story. Honoring and struggling for queer futures demands that we oppose white supremacy throughout our movements and across our educational spaces. For the sake of my presentation, I have divided my thoughts into 5 broad sections. 1, refusing white queer studies. 2, restoring queer studies. 3, queering the boundaries of thought. 4, embracing interdependence and care. And 5, teaching and learning with failure. Across these sections, I raise questions along the lines of, how can educators promote a critical understanding of queer theories, politics, bodies, and relationships that aligns with and advances racial justice? How can educators practice accountability to queer people of color, present both in the classroom and in the histories of queer existence and resistance? How can we inspire students to take on this same accountability in their own lives and works? How does failure to engage with queer of color critique and the racialization of gender and sexuality impact the possibilities of equity and justice within queer studies, queer educational spaces, and broader queer movements? Importantly, this presentation aims to make some concrete recommendations and suggest further conversations instead of providing a final and comprehensive resolution. I want to recognize as well that the conversations I identify are ongoing and have been taking place for decades within lots of different queer communities. Lastly, I also want to recognize that I'm advocating for queer racial justice from a position of racial advantage. Over the past several decades, queer studies and queer theories have been appearing more and more within the catalogs of courses offered at institutions of higher education. Yet the learning spaces where queer bodies, politics, histories, and desires are examined are also frequently marked by an entrenched whiteness. This whiteness develops from inattention to the numerous intersections of gender, sexuality, and race. As queer studies ascends to recognition within institutions of higher education, educators must devise, implement, and reflect upon queer teaching practices as methods of resistance that can both reproduce and disrupt the logics of white supremacy. And we must continuously examine our own positionalities relative to racial dominance. For all of us are bound up in white supremacy, and those of us who are racially advantaged have a responsibility to refuse our privilege by listening to and acting with the peoples negatively impacted by it. Refusing here does not mean denying racial advantage, but rather actively disowning it through ongoing solidarity work. Much of this anti-racist pedagogical work is about identifying and dismantling normativities within queer studies curricula, especially those relating to whiteness and its associated constructs, such as citizenship. Normativity here refers to socially constructed ideas about normalcy that determine whose experiences of inequity and injustice are recognized, talked about, and viewed as important, as well as whose experiences are discarded, hidden, and ignored. Heteronormativity is what makes queer and trans people vulnerable to hatred from others. and the normativity of whiteness exposes people of color to racialized violence. The power of normativity comes from the coding of differences between people, from the determination of which kinds of bodies and minds are expected, accepted, and tolerated, versus which are marginalized, unwelcome, and subjected to punishment. Moreover, normativities exist through one another. Heteronormativity is, in part, a manifestation of white supremacy and settler colonialism, which is to say that heteronormativity promotes white power while coding people of color as deviant, perverted, and sexually predatory. Consequently, when queer educators fail to center analyses of white supremacy and settler colonialism, we leave out significant portions of queer history and neglect to be accountable to queer students of color and to queer Indigenous students. For this reason, anti-racist practice is a necessary component of queer teaching that cannot be forgotten. Put another way, I am arguing that pedagogies that do not consistently and explicitly challenge white supremacy are not and will never be queer, for heteronormativity is an overwhelmingly racialized and colonial construct. From my perspective, white supremacist queer teaching is a paradox that undercuts the purpose of queer as a disruptive source of resistance. White queer activists who cling to fictional narratives of racial supremacy are, to state it bluntly, missing the point by leaning into our often unarticulated desires for dominance. Accordingly, some important questions for teachers to ask ourselves might include, how does our teaching lead students to question and critically analyze white supremacy? How does our pedagogy promote critical action towards racial justice? From an intersectional, anti-racist perspective, if our response to either of these questions is it does not, then we are falling short of the radical visions and purpose of queer politics and of queer studies as a space for critical intersectional social justice education. Intentionally guiding students to think about heteronormativity in connection to white supremacy and other systems of power creates opportunities for queer educators to stimulate intersectional coalitional politics. Intersectionality and coalition building each emphasize the importance of stretching ourselves across difference in order to inhabit alternative forms of togetherness and new ways of being with one another that are not dependent on dominance and oppression. In 1997, Kathy Cohen wrote an article arguing that queer activists too often neglected the connections between heteronormativity, race, and class, and in doing so, closed off important opportunities for coalition building across movements for social justice. As a result, rather than working against the social and material conditions negatively impacting queer lives, white queer activists often were and often continue to be lumping all heterosexuals together, as if poor Black women on welfare, for instance, experience the same sexual privilege as middle-class white men. Just over 20 years later, Cohen reflects on the ongoing erasure of queer of color histories and the lingering question of whether or not queer politics has ever really lived up to its radical potential. Queer educators must undertake a similar analysis of queer teaching. For despite the advancements in queer thinking and praxis over the last few decades, I continue to encounter people who, like the students referenced in the opening stories of this presentation, conflate queerness and whiteness. Based upon Cohen's work, as well as the many other activists and theorists who have been critical of queer politics and movements, educators must ask ourselves, how have we, as queer teachers, internalized white-centric histories that marginalize anti-racist thinking and action? And how are we transmitting our own inherited limitations to our students in ways that uphold white supremacy, settler colonialism, and other systems and structures of power? Reflexivity is one of our greatest tools. Queer teaching against white supremacy thus requires us to critically evaluate how we, as teachers, show up in our relationships with all our students, and how we make generative space for queer students of color and queer Indigenous students to show up and be present in our classrooms. More than mere content, queer teaching or teaching queerly is about reimagining the relationships forged in our learning spaces, especially in terms of power and authority. I understand queerness to be an expression of love for self and love for one's community, which then means that queer teaching fundamentally alters the relations of learning from power and control to empowerment and solidarity and agency. Thus, my pedagogical praxis is one in which I intentionally strive to exist in solidarity and kinship with my students, at least as much as I can from my institutional position. As a queer educator, I endeavor to see my students as whole people with their own histories and needs that do not disappear when they come into the classroom. Thinking about queer teaching as an expression of love and solidarity with students reveals opportunities to build bridges to other kinds of liberatory educational theory, such as the works of Paulo Freire and bell hooks. Yet, to build these bridges, queer educators must be committed to anti-racist politics and action, among other liberation struggles. We have to work towards a critical awareness of white supremacy and figure out how we can use this awareness to make the world a better place for all of our students. The process of figuring out how to enact an anti-racist queer pedagogy is one of grappling with current educational practices as they collide and overlap with the histories of white supremacy that have influenced contemporary queer politics and social movements. In her insightful essay, Heteropatriarchy and the Three Pillars of White Supremacy, Andrea Smith describes white supremacy as a social structure propped up and held together by three interconnected pillars: slavery/capitalism, genocide/colonialism, and Orientalism/war. Her account of white supremacy opens up space to think about the diverse expressions and lived experiences of harm among different racial groups, while also identifying how these things emerge from the same broader structure. It also allows us to think about how white supremacy operates as a storytelling device, as something that creates narratives to justify and propagate itself. Think, for instance, about how discourses of patriotism and citizenship function to normalize the presence of white peoples on stolen lands, as well as to explain away or rationalize racial violence. Queer educators have a shared responsibility to our students to engage them in critical thinking and conversations about how each of these pillars interacts with our understandings of gender and sexuality. We have this responsibility because ignoring the impacts of things like capitalism, colonialism, and war severely restricts which students can develop a sense of belonging and connection to the material. Additionally, neglecting these things fails to center the lived experiences and needs of queer and trans people harmed by these systems, while simultaneously permitting racially advantaged students to uncritically persist in their privilege. Moreover, naming these systems matters because of the chokehold each of them has attempted to claim over the lives of queer people. For instance, the hyper-commodification of white queer culture under rainbow capitalism poses real dangers of erasing the anti-capitalist histories of queer politics. Similarly, the pinkwashing of Israel and the Israeli occupation of Palestine promotes a vision of inclusivity, which obscures the queerphobia and transphobia inherent in settler colonialism, as well as the massive abuse and violation of indigenous peoples. Furthermore, attending to these three pillars of white supremacy honors the foundations of queer and trans movements for social justice, which were by and large started and led by queer and trans people of color. Failing to actively resist white supremacy in queer pedagogy neglects this history, thereby aligning the work of queer studies more with dominant educational institutions than with queer and trans peoples most in need of transformative justice. Queer teaching against white supremacy at once acknowledges and moves forward from this history, encouraging teachers and students to pursue connections across racial and other forms of difference as a means of building a new world. Queer teachers are responsible for engaging students in critical historical analysis because how we understand the past shapes what is possible in the future. So long as queer people of color are absented from and marginalized in the histories we teach, so too will queer students of color seem to be and probably feel out of place in queer studies classrooms. Centering different histories, racially conscious and responsible histories, however, yields a different narrative for our present and futures. If many queer learning spaces today are white, it is because of how we have storied them, how we have assembled and shared the stories of queerness. Unmaking the entrenched whiteness of queer studies demands we tell different stories or tell stories differently. Whereas Indigenous rhetorician Malia Powell teaches us, what we know and how we know emerges from the stories of our experiences of the world. To know the world differently, therefore, we require different histories. One strategy I have found particularly useful to the task of restoring is to begin courses with texts that center the lived experiences and struggles of queer people of color and queer Indigenous peoples. I have found that whenever a term opens with white queer subjects, queer people of color, as well as the racialized histories of queer and transphobia, too easily become an afterthought. White students in particular often become more reluctant to leave the comfort of their racial privilege. And at the same time, students of color can feel alienated or unvalued, leading them to lose faith in the teacher and in the class. Additionally, when queer and trans people of color are not represented from the start of a course, it leaves open too much space for students to internalize a belief that queer and trans people of color have not been leading queer movements since the beginnings, which is flat out wrong. Accordingly, when engaging with white queer theorists and activists, especially those who did not make a consistent and meaningful effort to account for their racial position, queer pedagogy demands that we actively work to keep white supremacy present in the conversation. The ways that white people, myself included, have been conditioned to so easily forget about white supremacy or to only think about it at certain moments reveals its normativity and its danger. When things become normalized, they become imperceptible, operate in the shadows beneath the level of our consciousness. To witness these things, we must make space for them to become less familiar to us, space in which we can recognize them for what they are. Part of the task of anti-racist queer teaching is to disorient students complicit in white supremacy and, in their disorientation, give them the inclination and tools to pursue racial justice. Queerness can help students become lost as a way to guide them down a new path. I have also found that modeling humility, accountability, and solidarity can be a deeply impactful tool for queer teaching because it provides students with a template and starting point for integrating these things into their own lives. As a white queer teacher, I model these things as well for queer students of color and queer Indigenous students in my class in order to show them my own self-awareness and desire to grow away from white supremacy. While modeling these things is unavoidably performative, I make sure to acknowledge that I still have easy access to racial power and that my unlearning of white supremacy is active and ongoing, that I have no intention of becoming the good white person TM. This means situating myself in relation to the material rather than separating myself from it, because I am a white person with racial power at all times. My whiteness does not go away just because I am facilitating a class that talks about white supremacy. Talking about myself in this way in front of my class can be frightening, as coming into accountability often is. Yet creating this space for critique is an essential part of transforming power in learning spaces and the world, for it is never enough to challenge power out there. We always need to challenge the power in here. The power dwelling among us and preventing us from being fully present and together in one another's company. When the opportunity arises, I also explore with my students strategies for holding ourselves and each other responsible for our actions, while also building community and togetherness. I seek to make taking accountability a generative process that feels more approachable and doable instead of overwhelming and abstract. The queer teaching practice I continue to refine starts with a series of reflexive questions. For as Kellen Kuski reminds us, quote, embodying queerness does not absolve me from racism, end quote. Nor does being queer or pursuing queerness release me from the need to be accountable for other forms of power and privilege present in my life. If anything, claiming queerness as a term for myself actually yields an even greater responsibility to understand how the interconnected histories of queerphobia and transphobia to which I am claiming belonging are affected by my whiteness. I need to be cognizant of how my presence and claims to belonging impact other people, because I do not want to reproduce or continue racialized histories of displacement or violence. The questions which queer teachers must reckon with include this critical attention to historical connection and belonging, because this history sets the terms for how we can love one another and practice togetherness. Suzanne Lumen, while not writing about white supremacy in particular, raises several questions about queer pedagogy that I find myself coming back to again and again. Quote, how can we imagine a queer pedagogy? As of yet, it is unclear what such a pedagogy might look like or for whom this queer pedagogy might be. What would be its ambitions and where would it take place? Is a queer pedagogy about and for queer students and queer teachers? Is a queer pedagogy a question of queer curriculum? Or is it about teaching methods adequate for queer content? Or about queer learning and teaching? And what would that mean? Moreover, is a queer pedagogy to become the house pedagogy of queer studies? Or is it about the queering of pedagogical theory? End quote. I would argue that queer pedagogies have the potential to be each of these things at different moments, and generatively so. Queer teaching, like queerness in general, thrives in its multiplicities and its refusals of a static and singular description. Sometimes queer pedagogy is what emerges from the embodiment by teachers and/or students of queerness, while at other times, queer pedagogy is about the queering of pedagogical practice. Queer pedagogy does exist in queer studies, yet it also provides teaching methods for other disciplines and learning spaces. It is at once particular and universal, localized and untethered. For me, these questions serve as a reminder that queer pedagogy must always be looking back on itself, and that queer teachers have responsibility to be reflexive about our teaching practice. Lumen then goes on to assert that, quote, queer pedagogy must learn to be self-reflective of its own limitations, end quote. And the educators attempting to enact a queer pedagogy must strive to know our own limitations and possibilities, particularly those which emerge in relation to our experiences of power and dominance. At the same time as we imagine queer studies accomplishing different things in different contexts, however, we might also think about these contexts as not all that different, given that they each revolve, in part, around queer resistance to normativity within teaching and learning spaces. This resistance to normativity involves the centering of different bodies and embodiments, as well as of the experiences, needs, and understandings arising from those bodies. Queer interventions into pedagogical theory are ultimately about generating space for different kinds of bodies and embodiments to be present among teachers and learners through the transformation of thought and action. Queer studies as an academic field and discipline is founded on the exploration of normativity's influence over bodies and modes of embodiment, and queer people's creative resistance to this power and control. And ultimately, queer teaching seeks to generate opportunities for us to know our own bodies and the bodies of other people in queer ways. For instance, queer teaching and learning might help us to appreciate possibilities for love or belonging with people we never imagined ourselves with before. Just as importantly, queer teaching and learning compel us to recognize how we are bound up in other people's pain and suffering. For when we participate in harm, knowingly or unknowingly, we prevent occasions for connection. As a space of love and solidarity, queer pedagogy strives to bring people together in genuine and radically honest ways that empower us to express our experiences and needs and receive validation and kindness in return. What I am claiming here is that queer teaching and learning are concerned with more than just the contents of knowledge, the information and understanding that teachers and students become familiar with. I maintain that queering knowledge is transformative because it is invested in critically questioning which things get counted as knowledge, which kinds of knowledge are encouraged and permitted, and which knowledges and ways of knowing are suppressed in order to reproduce normal distributions of power. In other words, queer teaching does more than just introduce facts and theories for students to ponder. Through queer teaching, educators seek to transform students' knowledge, to offer up to them a chance to think differently, more critically about the world and their positions in it. Deborah Britzman asserts that a queer pedagogy seeks, quote, to engage the limits of thought, where thought stops, what it cannot bear to know, what it must shut out to think as it does, end quote. Queer learning in this sense happens in the spaces where the known collides with the unknowable, where dominant knowledges are exposed to the unbearable and shut out knowledges or knowings of silenced, subjugated others. For when the unknowable things are spoken and exposed, dominant knowledges stop making sense, and the mythology of power is challenged and denaturalized. Thus, queer or queered knowledge is not just a different collection of known things, but a mental tool chest for resistant consciousness that empowers us to inhabit the world differently, especially in our relationships with other people. In fact, one application of a queer pedagogy might be to inspire students to become conscious of their desires for and consumption of knowledge, beginning with critical reflection about where they acquire knowledge from and how they extend trust or certainty to particular sources. This consciousness further involves exploration into the shadows of what they know, by which I mean that queer educators might stimulate students to practice metacognition, or contemplation about how their knowledge and understanding has been pushed and pulled in particular directions that resemble normativity and logics of power. This metacognitive practice animates students to think about why systems of power might make sense to so many people and how that sense-making is embedded in the organization of society. It reveals that knowledge is never neutral or apolitical, for what we are pressed to know, as well as what we are impeded from learning, has social and political ramifications always. Finally, continuing from this metacognitive work, queer pedagogy can urge students to ponder the limits of their own knowledge, both where those limits are now and where we want them to exist in the future. Pursuing queered relationships in learning spaces among students and between students and teachers is simultaneously a process of learning how to care about and for one another, and of unlearning internalized tendencies towards independence and domination. A significant aspect of my anti-racist queer teaching practice is the understanding that all our lives are not only interwoven, but interdependent and mutually constitutive. I borrow these concepts from my ongoing engagement with disability justice. Disability justice is a critical social justice framework that centers around the lived experiences of sick and disabled CRIP people, especially people of color and queer and trans folks. This framework offers a useful intervention into queer pedagogy because it places intersectionality, community care, and collective access at the center of processes of teaching and learning. As a CRIP inflected concept, interdependence names how we all benefit from and rely on our relationships to gain access to the care we need in order to thrive. Pursuing our interdependence in queer studies begins with the recognition by white and settler queer people of how often we have not been in right relationship with queer people of color and queer Indigenous people. Moreover, interdependence requires white settler queers to reflect on how often we have exploited people of color for our own benefit, and how irregularly we have shown up in solidarity for their struggles against white supremacy. Queer educators intervene in this exploitation when we urge students to bear witness to and think critically about the hidden and too often overlooked connections between systems of power. I also greatly value disability justice as a pedagogical tool because it, one, empowers me to help students engage with the intersections of queerness, transness, and disability and ableism. And two, it provides another occasion to talk with students about the interdependence of heteronormativity and white supremacy. Mia Mingus explains that ableism created the social conditions necessary for the medicalization and pathologization of queer and trans people, as well as the many eugenicist projects perpetuated against communities of color. Resisting ableism, therefore, comprises a space of unified action for queer and anti-racist movements, a vital opportunity for solidarity and shared struggle. Furthermore, as a multiply disabled and chronically sick person, I have observed firsthand how ableism obstructs people from expressing and accessing care for our embodied needs. At the nexus of ableism, queerphobia, transphobia, and white supremacy, caregiving and healing become the responsibility of individual people, rather than collective practices shared among relatives and neighbors, existing within a shared learning space. If queer pedagogy is about moving into a different mode of togetherness, then caregiving and healing must be central to our pedagogical practice, especially within the relationships we seek to build with our students. And how queer is that? Teaching and learning are so often imagined as emotionless, loveless, rational processes, but they certainly do not have to be any of these things. And they should not be so, because students are more successful and invested in their learning when they feel cared about, supported, and known by their teachers. Disability justice informed and anti-racist queer teaching in this sense is just good pedagogical practice. As I advocate for embracing interdependence and care, I want to recognize that part of this task involves releasing guilt and shame by welcoming failure into our lives. No one is perfect, and living in a society founded on logics of supremacy and hatred means that each of us has a lot of unlearning to do. From this perspective, I maintain that failure is a necessary part of growth. If we aren't failing, then we aren't doing the work of building towards equity and justice. I know that accepting failure can be difficult and scary, especially for those of us in academia who are so often conditioned into a need for perfection. Learning to move with failure is a process, and one I am still figuring out. The following quote from Ignagne et al. Helped me with this acceptance. Quote, "Failures can be reinterpreted as creative and generative. They can be deployed to foster collective and collaborative alternatives to our contemporary structures of knowledge and structures of society that depend upon binary, linear, and inequitable normativities," end quote. Much of the time, failure is seen as an endpoint. It's storied as a conclusion. However, the idea of failure being creative and generative suggests that it can be a starting point, a moment of questioning, revision, and transformation. Failure propels us forward. With that in mind, as we come to the end of this presentation, I have chosen to conclude with the recognition of queer teaching's inevitable failure. Queer pedagogies are perpetually imperfect and destined for failure because normativity has tentacles writhing in every direction. We cannot hope to live up to the incredible task of struggling against power at all times in our lives, no matter how hard we try. Yet, while some might see this inevitability of failure as a cause to surrender, I understand failure to be a space in which we can become more human with one another, where we can grow with one another in the direction of intersectional queer social justice. But only when we act on our failure, use our failures as cartographies and compasses for learning. The ubiquity of normativity makes failures to always express our queerness, as well as to always practice queering the world around us, a fact of being we can learn to inhabit. And through inhabiting failure, we can find company in other people like us who fail at being normal, who want something more than what is determined to be normal. Our failures can make us into companions and co-conspirators. Yet we all fail in our own ways, which means that we carry different responsibilities for responding to failure. White queer peoples and spaces have a history of failing to identify and refuse white supremacy. And now we have a responsibility to change that pattern by becoming better versions of ourselves, who grow from the past instead of hiding from it. Queer teachers must be the leaders in this transformation, for the positions we have claimed as our own bear the labor of spreading knowledge outward. We are a starting point for the creation of a different world. So that's the presentation I have. Before I open it up to question and answer time, I want to just take a moment to thank the people who helped to make this event accessible, the captioning and interpretation services, as well as all of the organizers who helped to make this webinar happen. And we're thinking about accessibility from the beginning. That was really great. So with that, I'll turn it over to some questions and do my best to provide answers.
First, I'd like to thank you for your presentation. That was wonderful. If anyone was unable to pull the PDF from the chat box, please reach out to the NCORE conference and we will make sure that you are able to get the slides if you would like. So we have a question for you. Could you explain more about the pink washing you mentioned in the Restoring Queer Studies section? They didn't get enough detail to try to research it.
Yeah, it was a quick example. So thank you for your question. So pink washing is an idea advanced by Dean Spade and some other queer theorists who are working towards acknowledging white supremacy and racial justice. Pink washing is the idea of appropriation of queer culture in order to justify harm, right? So a lot of the times we see militaristic spaces or colonial spaces presenting themselves as queer friendly or like havens for queer people as a way to obscure the violence and harm that they've caused. So the idea of pink washing in terms of Israel is the idea of using queer culture, of presenting Israel as a queer haven, a queer friendly space, as a way to draw attention away from the harm that's been done to Palestinian peoples who have been harmed, displaced, and are continuing to be harmed and displaced through that kind of settler colonial violence. And so my thinking in bringing up that example is to acknowledge that when we're talking about queerness in queer studies or in really any space where queer learning is taking place, we have to be aware of how sometimes what's seen as an advancement in queer liberation or queer social justice is actually an appropriation of queer movements in order to make white supremacy seem normal and natural, and to implicate queer folks in the ongoing racial oppression of different groups of people of color.
Wonderful, thank you. How do you manage the expectations of administration when they have standards that adhere to white supremacist ideals? My apologies.
Yeah, I think this is a hard question. I have been lucky enough to teach at an institution where queer teaching and anti-racist practice are valued and supported. I know a lot of other teachers are not. And I think specifically about like all of the legislation and movements against like critical race theory that have been going on. And some teachers are, legally not allowed to talk about race, or can lose their jobs for doing so. And there's everything in between too, with just different teachers being penalized in different ways for bringing up race, or trying to be pressured out of bringing up race at all. So I want to acknowledge that I am in an institution where talking about those things is supported, and my program's been really great about that. But in thinking about situations that are different from that, what I think is really valuable about queer teaching is that a couple things. First is it opens up opportunities for connection, right? So thinking about how if there are things that the institution supports or different conversations that are going on, then queer teaching can be a way of bridging those things, because queerness is inherently about connection. It involves, for me, centering intersectionality. It involves thinking about how boundaries are often imposed on us, even though they're not true. They're false boundaries. And, the divisions we imagine, for example, between like queer justice and racial justice or gender justice, those things aren't true. And because those struggles are inherently interconnected. So I think what queer teaching offers through that boundary breaking is the opportunity to have those conversations in ways that are more palatable for institutions. It's a way to introduce concepts and ideas around what's already taking place. And so I think that boundary crossing is really helpful. For the legislation against critical race theory, which has been really a lot lately, queer teaching, I think, offers a way to come at conversations about racial justice obliquely, right? So where instructors aren't allowed to talk about race or are actively punished for talking about race, queer pedagogy can help to offer tools to help students develop knowledge about race without necessarily talking about it directly, in ways that could cause active harm to the teachers. And I know like we should be resisting those things, but in the present moment, when it's not foreseeable that those things are going to be removed overnight, and that we're going to have to live with those policies, or any other kinds of hostilities towards talking about race. Queer pedagogy in its boundary breaking lets us introduce that conversation in a way that's different from, I think, what people are often expecting, and in a way that can keep us a little bit more safe and protected, while also still introducing conversations and concepts to students that can help them to develop a racial consciousness outside of the classroom, or to explore ideas for opposing white supremacy in their own ways. And so, I think that's it's a way of being supportive while also recognizing that we're in a pretty scary and difficult time, when we would really love to have great conversations, but that's often just not feasible. It's risky and dangerous. And so I want to recognize that. I think queer teaching can be a way to move away from the idea that just the conversation is over, and towards the idea that as we're thinking about queering knowledge and queering teaching, we can move towards the idea of the conversation is shut down in this way, but there are other ways that we could have that conversation, other ways that we could approach this topic and achieve our goals, even in this difficult moment. And so, I think to go back to the original question, I know I went off on a tangent a little bit, but The strongest thing I think for me is that because queer teaching resists boundaries, resists division, really focuses on connection, that what it offers is a way to bridge different conversations and make connections to work that's already going on. So in hostile environments, that's a space to change the narrative and engage in a different kind of conversation.
Excellent. Thank you. And no worries about tangents. We appreciate those here. So our next one starts with a thank you. They would like to thank you for this wonderful presentation. And they know that the presentation is more for teachers specifically, but could you speak to how you would recommend others, other helping professionals in other areas of higher education could make necessary changes and be more mindful in their everyday practices and interactions with their students?
Yeah. So thank you for thanking me. My presentation was, in a lot of ways, focused on teachers and instructors in courses. But for me, going back to the idea that queerness is really about breaking boundaries, I want to recognize that we can all be queer teachers, right? It's not just the people who are assigned as instructors are queer teachers. Rather, I think queer teaching can happen from anybody at any time. And so no matter what your position is within an educational institution, or even if you're outside of an educational institution, I think you can do queer teaching. And that's an important recognition. And so I think I'll give a specific example. So in my current position, one of my current positions, I'm an accessibility coordinator for an institution. And so the work I do is about helping students have more access to their courses. And so that can mean getting them different accommodations or different things like that. But part of my work that I view as connected to queer teaching here is the idea that I'm talking with students about what they've experienced as normal, right? A lot of students with disabilities view their experiences of harm as just normal parts of their lives, right? And so I think queer teaching in that instance can be intervening in that and saying, actually, that concerns me that you've experienced those things. And I would like to help you get out of the habit of seeing that as normal, because there are different options we have in different ways that we can address this situation that better meets your access needs, right? So the conversation there is about helping them to unlearn normativities, right? To unlearn the things they've been conditioned to accept as normal. And, you know, the other thing about that too is in my role, I'm often talking with students about mental health. And my focus of my position is on providing accommodations and helping them be more able to access the university. But a part of that conversation too can be helping them to think about the things that cause them to have concerns about mental health, right? So I think there's this narrative that things like anxiety, depression, different kinds of mental difference, that those are individual. They get pathologized, right? They're treated as something that's wrong with that individual. But in reality, mental health and mental difference are always socially mediated, right? So the things that are impacting people's experiences of anxiety and depression and anything like that are impacted by their positions within society, right? And so part of that recognition is that people from different social locations can experience mental health differently because of how they've been raised, what experiences they've had, but then also that that a lot of the times when they try and talk about mental health or reach out for resources, they can be treated differently in those instances, right? It's a completely different experience for someone seeking a therapist if you can only find a therapist that's not from your racial group, right? If you can only access someone who doesn't have the authority or experience or expertise to talk about how things like white supremacy are connected to internalized feelings of hopelessness or exhaustion or different things like that. And so to get back to the question from this tangent again, to get back, it's a recognition that that we can help to address those things that are normal and to change the narrative, right? I mean, for me, queer teaching is all about offering different narratives that intervene in our sort of typical or conditioned ideas about different things. And so that one example of that could be intervening in conversations about mental health and mental wellness, to think about how that's not just a reflection of what's wrong with the individual, but a reflection that people have different experiences within a society that is built on inequity and injustice. And that if we really want to support all of our students or all of the people who come to us, all of the people in our community, if we want to be supportive of them, then we can't just focus on changing them as individuals. We can always connect our work back to those broader resistance to things like white supremacy and queer and transphobia, and the different ways that people are impacted. So yeah, in summary, yeah, I think everyone can be a queer teacher. Queer teaching isn't limited to just one space, and it's always possible to use queer teaching to improve our own lives and the lives of people around us. And I don't know who asked the question in particular, but if it would be helpful to talk with me more about your specific situation, the specific work that you do, and how you could bring queer teaching to that, I'd be happy to have that conversation.
Now, do you have any recommendations for where people could go to learn some more? There was a lot of terminology you used that some of us may be unfamiliar with.
Yeah. So thank you for that question. And I know I did use some big terminology sometimes. I tried to simplify it down a little bit, but I know that some of it wasn't accessible, and I could have done a little bit better of a job there. But I would, there are lots of different places I would go to start. I'm not the kind of person who would recommend like you just Google queer pedagogy or go to your institution's library page and search for queer pedagogy, because a lot of the ideas that I've developed about queer pedagogy come from people who aren't necessarily even teachers, or who aren't writing about teaching in particular. For me, I think the best sources for understanding what it means to teach queerly and in a way that resists white supremacy. I think the best way to find that knowledge is to seek out people's narratives about that. And so, for example, Gloria Anzaldua's work has been really pivotal for me in that, right? And thinking about how she's, all of these different things all at once, and how whenever, I'm reading Borderlands, I'm not just reading about what it means to be a queer person, but also about what it means to be a part Indigenous person, a Chicana person, a person who's crossing multiple language boundaries, right? And how like all of those different identities exist through one another, right? And so it's impossible to just talk about queerness when talking about Anzaldua's work. We always have to be attentive to those multiple things that are overlapping and interconnecting. And that's, my ideas about queer pedagogy come a lot from dwelling in that overlap and that interconnection. And, I think for me, the most important part of learning how to be a queer teacher or how to teach queerly is letting go of the need to compartmentalize or segment things, right? So letting go of the idea that that queer studies is a space to talk about queerness, right? It's always a space to talk about queerness, but it's never just that. And thinking about then queerness isn't the description so much as the intention, right? So queer studies is a place where the intention is to think about queerness but that is not only queerness we're going to think about in that space. It's more of a centering rather than a marker of what's going to be included and not included. So things I would recommend are seeking out narratives. So like Gloria Anzaldúa is someone I would seek out. Stone Butch Blues is just a really phenomenal book for a lot of reasons. And there's a lot of great information in there about different histories, different connections between queerness and different other liberation movements. I think Leslie Feinberg offers us a really great template or starting point for thinking about what solidarity can look like in practice. Because Leslie was privileged in a lot of ways, but also recognized that building up a space in queer communities meant grappling with that privilege, meant finding ways to always be in connection and conversation with other people working against their own experiences of harm. And that queerness for them was ultimately about working past those divisions and thinking about how we advance a queer future when we work together, when we pursue connection and togetherness with other people. And then I can talk more with you like later about what other sources, but the last one I'll suggest for now is a lot of people writing about disability justice, I think are great sources for thinking about queerness and queer pedagogy. The work of Aurora Levins Morales has been really central to my work. And her work focuses on multiple different things of chronic illness, being a person of color, being a queer person, being someone who really struggles to be in connection with other people. So I think that work talks a lot also about like what it means to make space for one another, and that making space for one another isn't just like having an extra chair at an event, but rather thinking about what access means with the different opportunities and space making things you're doing. So how you're allowing people to be participating, how you're reaching out to them, following up with them, how you're supporting them in meeting their needs so that they can be a part of the conversations you're having. Because, a lot of, I think, mainstream queer movements came in with good intentions, and they often, weren't necessarily like deliberately keeping different marginalized groups of people out. But I think a lot of the times the space making they did was limited to just inviting people to be present without really grappling with the barriers to being present. And so I think Aurora Levins Morales' work does a really good job of thinking about what are those barriers and how do we build community, how do we build resistance, how do we work against power while being accountable to one another in the process, and while always being able to acknowledge the harm we're causing to other people, because living in an oppressive society means that we are unavoidably going to harm the people around us. No matter how much we say we're committed to ending white supremacy or ending queer and transphobia, ending misogyny, any of that stuff, no matter how committed we are, we're going to harm people around us. And that's part of the learning to accept failure too. Because if we're not willing to acknowledge that harm, then we can't really do much to move past it and to create futures where that harm isn't an inherent part of our relationships. Yeah, so those are just a couple of sources. I'm happy to talk about others too, but those are people who have been really influential and vital for me.
Well, thank you very much. Appreciate that, those recommendations. Now, our next question says that we know in academia, we can encounter individuals at a global level. How would you recommend engaging in white queer people who are engaging in white supremacy, but may view these types of conversations as an American thing?
Yeah, yeah. So I think recognizing that a lot of learning spaces aren't just tied to one location, and that there are oftentimes people from all over the world in a learning space, or even just people who have very different experiences. It could be international students, it could be people from the other side of the country, and those experiences will be very different too. But I think, acknowledging that that difference is always present is really important. Um, I think there are a lot of ways in which conversations about white supremacy get get tied to America, and that in some ways it is specific to America too. But also I think we can address how white supremacy is a global phenomenon. I think the article or the chapter by Andrea Smith that I referenced, Heteropatriarchy and the Three Pillars of White Supremacy, I think having that kind of conversation to help break down that white supremacy is everywhere all the time. It might not look the same in different contexts, but that structure is transnational. It's always present. I think having that kind of conversation can be a good way to help move past the idea that that white supremacy is just an American problem, because we can recognize that that war, imperialism, Orientalism have different histories, different implications, and different outcomes than like a history of slavery or a history of genocide in the United States, right? Those things aren't the same. But if we're talking about white supremacy as a multiplicity, as a system that is made up of different parts, different logics that interconnect with one another, then I think we can begin to move past those ideas that that the conversations are just an American issue, or just an issue that's tied to a specific location. And that I think is also a way to invite students like that to make connections to their own specific social locations, right? So if they're in a different country, then querying our ideas about white supremacy can be a way to say, hey, what does white supremacy look like in your country, right? How are racial and ethnic differences created and implemented in your own context, right? So I think you can acknowledge that, like, a lot of the times we're teaching about a particular history of white supremacy or a history that's tied to a particular location. But then I think we can first sort of disrupt that and try and teach about white supremacy in all of its different contexts, or in multiple different contexts. But then also we can help students to say, we know this is just part of the conversation, and we invite you to talk about how white supremacy shows up in your own spaces, and how that's connected to your own particular experiences with queerness. And so, yeah, I think there are ways to help move past that conversation, and to change that narrative a little bit too.
Thank you. I'm going to share a comment because it really resonated with my feelings towards this presentation as well before we get to the last question. It says, I truly appreciate you taking the time to share your experiences, teachings, and authenticity. By being so open in your use of storytelling and intentional language choice, you created a space to challenge, teach, and empower. Hope to learn more and perhaps connect in the near future. Now, for our last question for the day, could you speak a bit on how transphobia and racism are interconnected?
Yeah, sure.
This could be a very, very big answer, long thing, but yeah, please.
Yeah, this it's a big question, and I'm happy to try and offer a little bit of connection here. And so, transphobia, right, is this idea of violence and harm directed towards trans people as a result of breaking out of the gender binary, right? Of not occupying a particular assigned gender position. And so within that, there's ideas about what it means to be a man, a woman, or someone of another gender, and what it means to and how those meanings come to be, right? So we have particular ideas about gender, and how people are assigned to particular genders. Those are often biological. Some places are moving towards a more social model, but in many instances, transphobia is very much based in biological ideas about gender and punishing people for breaking away from that biology. So, and then within that, I want to recognize that biology is an inherent, ideas about biology are inherently racialized, especially in relation to gender, right? So we can think about how our understandings of maleness, of masculinity, are based around an image of whiteness, right? What it means to be a good man is often very much connected to white people. And then a lot of the times deviation from that, or assumed differences from that idea of a good man, is based in racialized meanings. So I think we can think about how people of color are often coded as sexually predatory, as having different parts than white people, right? Too much of a particular part or not enough, right? Those images are based on a biological narrative that that people of color are in many ways inferior to or different from white people, and then that those meanings are used to justify white supremacy. And so where transphobia comes into that too is then those racialized meanings about gender are used to differentiate or cause different kinds of harm to white trans people and trans people of color, right? So I'm thinking of some specific examples here. I'm thinking of how access to healthcare, access to gender affirming care is mediated by race and class. So I think it's a different experience for a white person to medically transition or to even socially transition than it is for a person of color. Part of that is due to the fact that that understandings and definitions of transness are also racialized, such that they're built around white people to a certain extent. And so when people of color go through that experience, and I'm not going to talk about what that looks like for them because that's not my place to do so. But it's a different experience because there's different social meanings tied to gender for white people and people of color. There's different responses to it, right? So how people are treated as a result of being a trans person is mediated by race. And I'm also thinking here about how trans people of color are disproportionately incarcerated, how they're disproportionately subjected to police violence and other kinds of harm. There's some great narratives, some great text to read about that. But the idea here is that, when we think about the visibility and acceptance that relative acceptance that a lot of trans people are experiencing today, it's not experienced the same way across race and class. And, a lot of the times that conversation we're having about trans folks is not thinking about how that's connected to race. And so there's a lot of different ways that they're connected. And I think I just sort of fumbled through trying to talk about the really broad question here. But in short, I think when we're talking about transphobia, we're often implicitly, or at least many of us are implicitly thinking about white trans people's experiences. And then we're not necessarily making an effort to address how trans people of color will experience gender and sexuality differently. Not because like there's an inherent difference across race, but because of how transphobia is socially constructed and how it's attributed and how it's connected to racialized ideologies. And I'll give one more example and then I'll stop rambling a little bit. But I'm also thinking about how settler colonialism, which is a system of power about the eradication and displacement of indigenous peoples. Settler colonialism in many ways depended upon gendered violence against indigenous folks, right? So a lot of violence against indigenous two-spirit peoples, third gender peoples, and that violence was inherent to the colonial project, right? So part of what colonization involved was the imposition of Western European ideas about normal, proper gender and sexuality. And so when there were cultures or nations or different groups of people who had different ideas about gender and sexuality, colonialism often meant forcing people out of those ideas, either through eradication, extermination, or just other forms of violence that cause them physical harm for existing outside of a gender binary, right? And so when we're thinking about histories of transphobia too, I think we're implicitly connecting that to whiteness without recognizing how, in many cases, indigenous peoples, for example, have a long history of transphobia because of the way that settler colonialism depends upon a gender binary and normalizes violence against indigenous two-spirit folks.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Sam. Well, I'd like to thank Sam Shelton one more time for this wonderful presentation. And actually, I have one more question for you. If you can answer it quickly. Is there a distinction between equal employment opportunity policies versus diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I think I don't know if I have enough time to get into that all here, but I can offer like a quick answer. I would say yes. I think the concepts that we use to guide our work are very important. And so I think diversity is a term that's very loaded and it can mean different things in different contexts. But for me, diversity often ends up being more about trying to just have different people present or have the image that different experiences and ideas are recognized and respected. But I think diversity often attempts to do those things without addressing broader systems and structures of power. So I think, and sometimes diversity is about difference, but not about power. And to really get to a society where we have equity and justice, we have to talk about both. We have to talk about difference and recognize that we are in a situation where there are concerns about diversity because of how power has operated to silence difference and to marginalize different groups of people. And then, equality, I think equality often has a different interpretation, and it can be a good interpretation or a bad interpretation depending on who's implementing it. Part of this too, I think, is just recognizing that language is inherently flawed. Sometimes the language we're given isn't the language we would use, and that doesn't necessarily mean that that is going to guide our language, right? Sometimes we use the terms that we're given because that's the best way to move forward. So I think equality can sometimes mask difference as well, right? I think equality sometimes gets interpreted as everybody just needs the same thing, or everybody wants the same things, right? When a lot of the times people don't need the same things to be successful because of how society has structured people to be in really different places, right? So like histories of income and wealth inequality, right, mean that that white people and people of color aren't going to necessarily need the same supports to be successful. And so I think equality can be detrimental, but it can also be really useful if we're thinking in terms of equality of opportunity, equality of access. There are different ways that I think equality can be really impactful. I tend to lean towards more ideas of equity, access, and social justice. For me, equity means recognizing that people sometimes need different things based on where they're coming from. And so equity is about helping us to achieve our goals while being attentive to difference and recognizing that building a better world means working from that recognition of difference. And so yeah, in summary, again, I think, yeah, there is a difference between them. I think in terms of the words used, there's a definitional difference, but that's not to say that the people engaged in that work, the people using those terms aren't also having important conversations or being engaged in like the same critiques of that themselves, because I think sometimes those concepts and those pathways are what are made available to people, and then sometimes the best way to work towards a better future is to use those and do your best to just go forward from there.
Excellent. Once again, thank you very much, Sam Shelton. I would like to remind everyone that webinar recordings will be posted to the NCORE webinar on demand page in about a week, and we will also be sending a follow-up email with a link to the video as well as to our evaluation for the session. So please make sure you fill out that evaluation so we can give that feedback to Sam. Thank you very much, and I hope everyone has a wonderful day, or rest of their day, and be well.
Thank you, everyone.